Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, July 30th, 2026. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And back again, at long last, our longtime tech commentary columnist, now a columnist on the Free Expression vertical at the Wall Street Journal, and knower of all things technological and COVID-related, James B. Meigs. Welcome back, Jim.
It's great to be back, John.
Okay, so we're going to devote this podcast to the Fauci hearing and the Fauci diary and the Fauci controversies because throughout the COVID period, Jim wrote at least 6 significant articles for commentary on the lab leak hypothesis, the public health response, the top-down problem with public health seeming to impose its totalitarian ideas on how people should live their lives and all of that. And the major thing that you were extremely cautious about was the discomfort with the question of whether or not the public health and social media and media atmosphere was making it impossible for people who had honest questions about the development of the COVID virus to get their views expressed in public, and that they had been shut down, they had been deplatformed by social media. Efforts were made to fire them, to defund them. Now what is the Great Barrington Declaration, which was an assemblage of scientists and virologists who expressed skepticism about the wet market theory of the COVID spread, were basically kept off the airwaves and out of respectable publications and all of that. So this was stuff that you read, but you were very careful to say, we don't know if it was a lab leak or the wet market. We don't know, and we should understand that people are acting in somewhat good faith about how they need to suppress, how the COVID virus needed to be killed off at the very least, even if we didn't know how its origins were. Now, here we are, 2026, the diary's out, Fauci has testified, we know all the things that we have come to know. How do you feel today, before we get into his testimony and the things that he said, how do you feel today about the lab leak theory, the wet market theory, and the question of the public health response from the 4-year vantage point?
You know, at each stage, my faith in these public officials has gone down by a big notch. Early on, I agreed that, it was a chaotic situation. We didn't know exactly what was going on. You could understand some missteps or oversteps. You don't want a Monday morning quarterback the early decisions. But as the pandemic went along, and we saw our public health officials, most notably Anthony Fauci, who was really the face of the whole operation, even when he didn't have operational control over certain agencies, we saw how they gradually, how they didn't learn from experience. They didn't change their policies when new information came in. They served as handmaidens when the Biden administration came in, they served as handmaidens for the teachers' unions and other activist groups. As you guys were saying on the podcast yesterday, there was this effort to use COVID as sort of a blanket validation of all kinds of progressive policies, like no evictions and things like that. So, and the other thing that we saw was from the get-go, this effort to suppress any discussion of the idea that the virus came from the Wuhan lab, which, looking back, it was so overwhelmingly likely that a bat-related virus in a in a that had been modified emerge and hit the public, or probably possibly modified genetically, emerge and hit the public right as the right in the city where the lab that specializes, the world's leading lab that specializes in that kind of research, where that was located.
I was having a conversation with somebody last night who has not followed the ins and outs of this over the last 6 years and was puzzled by the hostility to Fauci shown by Rand Paul and the senators. And
I'm glad you're bringing this up. I've had similar. I was going to bring up similar experiences.
Okay. Yeah. So, those of us who were granularly involved in watching this, and of course, this podcast's evolution into a daily voice, entirely the result of COVID. We started doing it in the middle of March when everything shut down as a daily update on where we were with COVID, as a way for the staff of commentary to sort of at least lay our eyes on each other over Zoom at the very least. And then it sort of grew from there. So this is something that we have been watching. We watched for 2 years on a daily basis, like everybody else, but very, very focused. And people have forgotten, or they haven't paid attention. So if we could try to come up with a narrative that explains why Rand Paul was so furious with Fauci, and why Fauci said Rand Paul is obsessed with me and wants to throw me in jail, and that's why I'm going to take the fifth 111 times. There is a narrative that explains the lab leak. Then there is a narrative that explains why it was not a lab leak. And the narrative that explains why it was not a lab leak, it appears, has crumbled under the weight of circumstantial evidence over the last 4 years that the not a lab leak people had all kinds of reasons, personal, professional, and possibly criminal, to argue that it was a naturally occurring phenomenon. And that in February of 2020, they had a meeting together and basically laid out the idea that they were going to make a phalanx, say it was naturally occurring, say that anybody who said that it was a lab leak was a conspiracy theorist who had bad designs on Asian phobia,
right?
Xenophobia, phobia against this was a war against the Chinese and all of that. Can we start with the September 2019, this is why it was probably a lab leak origination date, and sort of move forward, just to lay that out, if that's...
Right. Well, I would roll the date way back, much earlier. There had been a controversy around the gain-of-function research, where viruses are you described it well yesterday, viruses are modified genetically in ways that are supposed to mimic what might happen naturally. And then you have this more dangerous virus, and then you can say, okay, let's make a vaccine, or let's study how we can control it if it happens to evolve in this way. Now, one virologist I talked to compares this to looking for a gas leak with a lit match. Viruses escape from labs all the time. There have been many cases of diseases infecting a lab worker and then getting out into the public. But this research was very controversial. There was kind of an outrage over one particular study. The Obama administration tried to put a clamp on it and asked the NIH to severely limit this kind of research and make sure it was only done under very, very close supervision. There were a few virus experts in the U.S. who wanted to continue the research. Fauci was generally an advocate for gain-of-function research. The funding continued for some of this research through the EcoHealth Alliance. It was kind of so the NIAID, Fauci's agency, wasn't making direct decisions over every grant handed out. And some of these grants went to research that was where American scientists and scientists at the Wuhan lab collaborated. And there were a number of projects they worked on together. So you could say this is a way of evading the American restrictions on the research. There was one particular proposal for a study that would take a SARS virus, modify it with this what's called a furin cleavage site, a spike protein that makes it bond to human cells in the respiratory tract more readily. And this is like a recipe for COVID-19. It's like the exact roadmap, if I can mix my metaphors. That did not come through NIAID. That came through that proposal went to the Defense Department, but they turned it down. And so, as far as we know, that research was not funded by the U.S. What a lot of people, including me, suspect happened was, well, by the time that proposal was made, the research was already underway. This happens frequently in science. People start a project and then it's going pretty well and they need more funding. Then they make the research proposal, the grant proposal. Or it continued under Chinese supervision. So it sounds likely that Americans were not involved as that project went forward, if that was the source of COVID. But there's every reason when we saw COVID to say, that looks just like that the project was called Defuse. It looks just like that Defuse proposal that was turned down. So when the virus started circulating in Wuhan, a lot of people, even those who didn't know about the Diffuse proposal, were immediately suspicious. What's fascinating, what's going on now, and you mentioned that February 1st phone call, is we have been told that all the leading scientists are very, they don't think they didn't think it was a lab leak. They were pretty sure it came from nature. But in fact, on that call, one of the things that comes out in Fauci's diary, which was released by Rand Paul, was that most of the scientists on that call, leading scientists, were pretty suspicious it did come from the lab. And Fauci himself at one point said, well, it looks like it didn't come from the wet market. And the wet market was the main theory for if it did hop over from animals, that's the likely place because that's where it spread a lot in the city. So how did they go from all being pretty worried about what was going on in Wuhan, thinking it was pretty likely the virus, or at least highly possible the virus came from a lab, to 6 weeks later, the same scientists published this paper, the famous Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper, that said there was no plausible, any kind of lab-based scenario was not plausible. It had to have come from animals. How did they go there? And that's where I believe we really are looking at something like a conspiracy here. There was an organized effort to deflect attention from the long history of American researchers and American funding going to the lab. It was too embarrassing. It might hurt. They probably justified it to themselves if this is how it happened by saying, we have such important work to do. We're in the middle of a crisis. Having all this stuff come out about this controversial research some of us were involved in would be too distracting. There'd be a backlash. These crazy Trump people would be all over it. Let's just sweep that under the rug. Let's just steer people away from it. And they did that very, very effectively over it took about a year before the lab leak questions resurfaced in a major public way. And as you say, not only did they get the press to drop the story, they really intimidated other scientists into dropping, or they thought, all these leading people say there's a clear scientific explanation that it must have come from animals. So I don't need to look into it because they've already settled the question. Scientists can first they have a lot of self-protection because they get the NIAID was the major source of grant funding in this field. But also, nobody wants to be a total outlier and isolated with an unpopular opinion. Very few people are willing to do that. So this conspiracy of silence was very, very effective. And to some degree, even though they've gradually dragged this information out, by any means necessary after Fauci and his crew tried to hide it, to some degree, this sort of quasi cover-up is continuing to this day. If you look at how the media covered the hearings yesterday.
I think what's important to note is that the EcoHealth Alliance, that NGO that we are talking about, So there's no direct funding of gain-of-function research after the Obama administration's tightening of the rules. But EcoHealth Alliance received uh, 9, 10, 12, $15 million a year from the federal government. And it then distributed that in the form of grants. So the money wasn't for gain-of-function research, but money is fungible. So if money from the EcoHealth Alliance was going to the Wuhan labs, though not for gain-of-function research, it effectively was paying for gain-of-function research, even if it was not specifically earmarked for that purpose. That's why I think the conspiracy would have happened, that it became very clear that something major and catastrophic had happened. And the idea was that there was this very close relationship between the EcoHealth Alliance and Fauci's agency and these virologists, and that they did not want to be tagged with any relation to COVID. And this dovetailed with the Trump people are crazy and they're going to want to blame China because they're xenophobes, which people forget. But like, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, told everybody to go shop in Chinatown because people were too afraid to go because there was a disease in China. Don't do that. Go shop in Chinatown, because that would show that you're not like a Trump stooge. I just want to say one thing, and then I want to bring Abe and Seth into this and make a confession. So you're talking about people who don't want to be outliers. And I will confess that I myself was intimidated by this consensus. It's very important to me as we were doing these podcasts on COVID, as they were going on in 2020. We talked about how we were very critical of the public health response. We were critical of locking up playgrounds. We were critical of the idea that you had to arrest people on beaches. And we were certainly incredibly critical of school closings. But, friends of mine, people also members of the commentary board, would say to me, hey, you should have Jay Bhattacharya on the podcast to talk about Stanford scientists, talk about, he thinks that, there was not a natural origin, and he's sort of spearheading an investigation into this, and you should have him on. And I was like, I'm not going to have him on. Like, I don't want to look, I want us to look like we are sober and responsible people talking about this matter, and we're criticizing the public, we're criticizing the response, but we're not in a position to criticize Fauci and the scientists. And I don't want to touch that. And I feel I'm abashed and ashamed of that, because I was perfectly aware of Jay's and Scott Atlas's, a former contributor to commentary, how serious people they were and how they should be taken seriously. But a kind of consensus had been formed that only crazy people were arguing for the lab leak. And while I didn't believe they were crazy people, I thought it would be discrediting to line up with them. And from this vantage point, 6 years later, that was a shameful decision on my part.
Well, John,
let me just jump in on one little thing. The Great Barrington Declaration was focused on shut down school closures and the social impact of those. The lab leak thing was a slightly different thing, but the point stands. Those guys were really treated like wacky outliers, and it was hard to stand up and say, "Hey, we need to look at this."
I was going to say, John, I as someone who traveled a similar path to yours, I think you're being a little harsh on yourself, because don't forget, while there were serious dissenters of the dominant narratives, there were also very popular, crazy crank critiques that are still circulating. Everything from Bill Gates is going to put something in the vaccine to this entire thing was planned to sort of change the social organization of the world, and create a world government or something, and everything in between. So there was reason to be discerning and cautious. And just something I want to touch on in talking about the original lab leak origin switcheroo is that the other maddening thing about this, well, two more maddening things about this. One is that it let China off the hook for its mishandling and deception of the mishandling. That's a serious problem. And the other is, don't forget about the crackdown on dissent in terms of social media platforms, where you would be silenced, taken off, or whatever, shadow banned or whatever else for a dissenting opinion on this. Even those dissenting opinions that turned out to be right.
And even more important, that they were directed to do so by the federal government, which was suppressing the speech, was actively working under the grounds that we were in an emergency condition in which tens of millions of people would die if people didn't behave the right way, that the federal government was directing private companies to suppress the speech of Americans. That was one of the two things that had, I think, all of us going, oh, wait a minute there, buddy. That was one. And the other was, and this pops up in the Fauci diary, when the mask slipped from the we need to control everybody because the disease is going to spread, there were these moments of mask slippage, and Andrew Cuomo was the king of the mask slippage, right? So he was having these daily briefings. He was a hero. And then he would announce that he was going to allow bars to open in the summer of 2020, but only if they were 25%, if the occupancy hit 25% of the sort of fire code, and they couldn't serve food. They could only serve alcohol and
they had to serve food. They had to serve food.
Oh, they had to serve food. That's right. I'm sorry. They had to serve food, and
they had to close by 10 p.m.
Right.
So the virus could go to sleep.
So one point it was 25%, another point it was 35%, and you could see how it was like he was sitting like a general, with a map with little warplanes and little tanks moving them around to see how he wanted to control the businesses and populations of New York State. And Fauci has these moments in the diary and had his own moments, like when he said, I'll declare the pandemic over when 80% of Americans get both shots. In the diary, he says he was told by whoever it was that told him that the second shot was largely unnecessary, that in fact it did not have a preventative effect. It only had a lengthening effect on the efficacy of the Moderna virus. Remember that we were still in pandemic conditions for a year on the grounds that we weren't hitting the proper numbers that were totally invented, 80%, 90%, 60%. We weren't hitting the numbers properly for the federal government to take its boot off the throat of American businesses, American education, and all of that. And that's one of the salient details in the diary that reveals that there was extraordinary bad faith, I think. So that's my take. Jim, do you have an overall take aside from the obvious comic vanity stuff that everybody is, sort of throwing?
Well, a lot has come out in the last few weeks. There was the release of the diaries, which I want to know. We call them diaries. They were they were records made on his work computer, stored on a database at work.
Yeah.
That
And it's
where he
why
was
we
taking-
have them. We
Yeah,
have them
I mean,
because they were not his private. They were, he wrote
right.
them on a
So,
government computer.
he's acting like it's some great violation of his privacy, but these are work records of his meetings and stuff. And then we also have this trove of Slack messages between his ad hoc crew of top virus advisors, and these include the authors of the proximal origin paper, a lot of the people who were on that February 1st call, top leaders in the field, and their communications are just jaw-dropping. First of all, how kind of vicious and vindictive they are. Anyone who questions, they were doubting the lab leak theory. Nonetheless, they were pushed, cajoled, whatever, into writing this proximal origin paper to stress that no lab scenario was plausible. There's evidence that a lot of that pressure came from Fauci and from Collins, the overall head of NIH, who they called the Bethesda boys, and that they were really orchestrating this. And then then if anybody, but they had all these doubts. But then in public, they were in lockstep that the lab leak thing was impossible. And then when anybody came out with some questions about it, and one of the principal one is this remarkable woman named Alina Chan, and I've quoted her many times in commentary columns, City Journal pieces. She co-wrote a book with Matt Ridley early on about the origins of the virus. And she was a postdoc at Harvard MIT Broad Center at great risk to her career. She started looking into this. She published an early paper asking questions about the genome, whether it had been manipulated. So she was one of the first to kind of, as a scientist, break this out. They are vicious to her. They called her an idiot. They at one point even imply violence to her. I assume kind of joking, but the nastiness is it's so much not what you want to hear from science leaders. You know that these things get personal, but it's kind of stunning. And I use the word conspiracy to describe this. It really. Me, I've spent a lot of my career arguing against 9/11, truthers and stuff. Yeah. But conspiracies do happen. And this was one, not a conspiracy to invent COVID, not a plandemic, but to hide the associations between our public health institutions, grant-making organizations, and leading scientists, and this research that was going on in the Wuhan lab. And you can see them working kind of behind the scenes to talk about how to marginalize people, how to take down ideas that they didn't like, how to shut down discussions. And I have to say, I started out seeing Fauci, and I think earlier in his career he was a well-intentioned public servant. But over the years, he accumulated so much power that when this hit, he felt that it was his job in this sort of imperious fashion to really be the czar of not just COVID, but COVID information. COVID and he personally visited other agencies and leaned on them to take certain positions, to censor certain kinds of speech. And when the Biden administration came in, they went whole hog on this stuff. So it is a pretty shameful episode. And I had one of those conversations myself with a friend the other day, and I was talking about some of this. He goes, "Well, no, I just think they were doing their best in a difficult situation. They meant well." I no longer think that. I no longer think they meant well. I think they were attempting to protect their own prestige and power, and avoid bad publicity for some terrible decisions that had been made earlier that may have contributed to this worldwide scourge. I mean, it's kind of outrageous that 6 years after the pandemic, we still haven't had a full investigation. After the space shuttle, immediately Reagan ordered this blue ribbon commission. Neil Armstrong was on it. I mean, all these top people, Feynman, the most famous physicist, all these top people were on this committee to investigate the space shuttle thing. NASA totally opened their books. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. There was complete transparency. The opposite happened here. The exact opposite. Covering up, avoiding Freedom of Information Act requests, figuring out how to sidestep things, stonewalling Congress. I think it's a real shameful story.
I mean, I think that's why the dating of the controversies is so important. We were sort of led to believe that it was sometime at the very beginning of 2020 or the very end of 2019 that evidence began to emerge of trouble in this one city in China. It turns out that it was 3 or 4 months earlier. This amazing, I don't think it was Chen, but somebody who actually found documents in Chinese that had been left weirdly exposed on the internet, and found millions of pages that revealed that they were already worried about what was going on in September of 2019, and that this meeting, this February 2nd, 18 persons, whatever it was, meeting,
12 people, yeah.
12 people, is a functional conspiracy. I mean, that is to say, they got together. Then Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, circulated this paper. He got all these people to they sent a letter to the Lancet, the foremost medical journal in the English-speaking world.
It was actually Nature. Actually, it was Nature Medicine, but
Nature. I'm sorry.
Idea.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they sent this letter saying there was no chance of a lab. With foreknowledge of the fact that there was no way to say that it wasn't a lab leak. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say they thought maybe the preponderance of evidence suggested that it wasn't a lab leak, though in fact it seems to me the preponderance of evidence suggested the opposite. But even if you believed otherwise, you can't say there's no way that it was a lab leak. That's crazy. Like, that's not science. Like there was no determinant. It had barely started spreading yet. They were already covering it up before everybody started to get sick. People started to get sick in America in March, not in February and not in January.
And they were already, Fauci was already calling it a conspiracy theory.
Your column, Jim, has dates that to February 1st of that year, February 1st, 2020. So really early. You have Fauci organizing that call of all the virologists and everybody and signing and putting out a combined statement saying, essentially, there's no way there's no evidence this could have been a lab leak on February 1st. So the talking point.
The statement came out March 16th. The letter was published March 16th. But it was incredibly early to be fighting this action, to answer a question that very few people were even asking yet.
I mean, I think it was either March 13th or March 15th. That everything shut down. It was in New York. That was when the theater shut down. That was when the Madison Square Garden shut down. And that was the moment when everything changed. So we're talking about 6 weeks earlier. Now, I went to a bat mitzvah that weekend, like March 7th, something like that. And 5 or 6 people at that bat mitzvah who had been at the big APAC meeting in Washington 2 weeks earlier, 5 or 6 people got really, really serious, life-threatening cases of COVID. So it was like one of the first super spreader events. Two close friends of mine were like in the ICU at Mount Sinai. One of them really did nearly die. They were poo-pooing the danger of COVID in February. That's the other part that we forget. It's not like I was hearing from friends of mine who do risk assessments for like hedge funds who were saying, sell, like everything's going haywire. That's what we're hearing from our people in China and all of that. And de Blasio is telling people to go shop in Chinatown. Like, there was no sense of impending doom at all in February, except Fauci and the virologists seemed to know that doom was coming soon. and and what they needed to do was, rather than warn and start organizing, including ventilators and all of that stuff that we ended up getting so crazy about, they decided that they needed to create a phalanx to advance one simple view and go with that.
It's funny. I have so many questions. I still have questions about the ventilators, because people forget that ventilator madness. We didn't have enough. We had to start manufacturing them, and then they just stopped using them anyway. I mean,
well, they were bad. It turned out that the ventilators were.
That's what I want to know, is how bad. But
they weren't killing. But I mean, they were kind of. They were making people worse. It's like apparently it's a very extreme thing to put somebody on a ventilator, and like triggers your immune system and does all kinds of things. But that was So we were obsessed with ventilators. We were washing our groceries. We were covering our hands instead of our mouths. Then it turned out that the masks were ineffectual, but you still had to wear them. That's what I mean about the intimidation stuff.
But
masks were nonsense in August of 2020, and my kids went to school for a year in masks. I did not believe in the efficacy of masks, but I was wearing them. We were all wearing them. We were on subways wearing them. We were everywhere. We were wearing them. Our kids had to wear them. You had no way of being, sort of like the village atheist. Like there was, you would be ostracized. You would be, your kids wouldn't be allowed to go to school.
I just want to touch on Jim's point that at some point he came to believe that the certain officials were no longer doing their best, but didn't have complete knowledge or whatever. One of the details of Fauci's diary or records or whatever it is, there are all these entries showing his preposterous self-regard and vanity, and it's safe to say I'm one of the 5 most important talked about people in the world, and then I'm a sex symbol, and and all this. And that's not a sideshow to the main story, to the deception. It's the same story, because it shows how, and Andrew Cuomo also falls into this category. It shows the mindset that allowed these people to act as if they could wave their magic wand, pronounce anything, say anything, set anything in motion, and it's going to work, and people are going to buy it. The self-regard is a big part of the deception.
And the way it caught on. There's a 2021 clip of Gretchen Whitmer, who was governor of Michigan, talking to CNN, and in the background there's a Fauci throw pillow.
Well, that is very true, and it's important because of the loop, the feedback loop, which is Fauci. They say we're closing the schools. Was there a nationwide? What are you, crazy? You can't close schools. Our kids are going to have learning loss. How am I going to take care of my kids and do work if they're not allowed to go to school? What are they going to learn? How is this going to happen? The feedback loop was everybody who was telling you that schools need to be closed were making heroic decisions to save millions of lives. And you were going to complain that it was a little inconvenient for you not to have to figure out how to deal with your kids at home. This was going to kill the planet off. And so there was no brushback. There was no blowback. There was merely a consensus that they were partially architects of, to protect themselves, and then weird things happened, like Cuomo's ouster as governor of New York, which nominally came as a result of his sexual harassment of women. I think that was a cover for the fact that the nursing home scandal in New York State had gone viral among people and had made him finally vulnerable for his actions and his behavior when people learned about the nursing homes and the suppression of data from the nursing homes and all of that. And that made the press uniquely, for the first time, able to start publishing critically about Cuomo. And then that was a sort of a boulder that started rolling down the hill. That never happened with Fauci. And I think one of the reasons is that the distorting figure of Trump. So we should maybe just, Trump was president. He was making those press conferences. He was saying, what about bleach, or what about, showing white light down people's throats or whatever, seemed inconstant and nuts. But I'll tell you another story, which is that, Trump said, what about this hydrochloroquine, this possible, this medicine that you could take that would alleviate the symptoms of COVID or cure you from COVID. And he mentioned it. And there was this explosion. He's so irresponsible. What does he do? This is horrible. How dare, this is crazy. So it just happens. I have a friend, I'm not going to say who it is, commentary contributor, doctor, very, very, very senior, very distinguished medical professional of very long standing, who got COVID, and his son-in-law got COVID and his daughter got COVID. And he prescribed all three of them hydrochloroquine in May of 2020, and they were cured. I knew this. This happened. This happened to this is the opposite of a crazy person, and he was like, "Why not? I'm 90. I could not. I'm not harming myself, because if it goes wrong, it goes wrong, and I don't think it'll harm my son-in-law and my daughter." So even Trump, everything Trump said was deemed crazy. And even this hydrochloroquine thing became a that was evidence of madness.
You
But
see
it
this.
clearly wasn't.
You see this in the lab leak thing. As soon as Trump mentioned it, they started trying to suppress it long before Trump mentioned it. I don't think Trump mentioned the idea of a lab leak until April, but Tom Cotton had mentioned it as a possibility. Tom Cotton's mention was misrepresented in the Washington Post as if he'd said China deliberately released this as a bioweapon. He said it sounds quite likely that it was an accidental release, but his statement was misrepresented, and but there was really very little talk about it when this whole idea of suppressing the lab leak possibility went into action. But then, over the next couple of years, the idea that it might have been a lab leak was seen as serving sort of a MAGA interest in criticizing elites, criticizing the public health system, which, of course, we now know really merited that criticism. They were operating very irresponsibly with this gain-of-function research. Many leading members of that community thought it was irresponsible. But once the COVID happened, most of them kind of closed ranks and kept their mouths shut. So, and what I'm interested in, it took a couple of years, but eventually the arguments for the lab leak got more of a fair hearing. Even the New York Times did some pretty good pieces on the issue. It seemed like we were coming back around to a more balanced view of the question. But it's really interesting what's happened since. Since Fauci retired and wrote his autobiography, a lot of the press has kind of drifted back to their original settings, and you see this in the way that they covered yesterday's hearing. In the Times today, there's a columnist compares Rand Paul to Joe McCarthy, on this kind of crazed quest to root out, to destroy the reputation of one man. And I'm not a huge Rand Paul fan in many areas, but he's right about this, and his efforts to drag out these documents that they've been trying to keep hidden has really served the public interest, and he has every right to be fired up about it. But the press has largely covered this as poor Anthony Fauci, this brave public servant, once again dragged to this humiliating ritual and being threatened. And yeah, it's true. A lot of the things these guys say, some of the stuff Trump says is over the top. But the misdeeds of Anthony Fauci and his cohort are serious, and they require a sober investigation, which we haven't had. And the press is acting like this is all just some kind of a right-wing sideshow and a personal vendetta against basically nice guy. I don't buy it. I reviewed his autobiography. He doesn't come clean about any of this stuff. He barely talks about the lab leak. He spends maybe 2 pages on it. He says, well, it's still overwhelmingly likely it came from an animal. And then he cites 2 papers supporting the wet market theory, both of which have been, if not debunked, seriously challenged by leading scientists to the degree which it's journalistically irresponsible to cite them without noting that they've been seriously challenged, if not debunked. So he kind of expected readers of his autobiography just sort of go along with his version of events. Many of them did. It got very positive reviews. I remember the New York Times said, Dr. Fauci deserves his victory lap. No, he doesn't. He had a long career, did a lot of great things. His work on AIDS was really impressive, but he was in that position too long. He acquired too much power. He abused that power when we needed, a fair-minded, sober, disciplined leader of our public health bureaucracy more than ever.
I think also, there's polling in the last couple of days, terrible polling for Trump, bad generic polling for the Republicans. But then if you dig into it, the polling for the Democratic Party is equally catastrophic. 70% of Americans have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. 19% have a favorable view. Why am I bringing this up in this context? Because though there has not been the reckoning, though this phalanx has managed to prevent the 9/11 Commission, Warren Commission, Challenger Commission kind of approach to this national emergency catastrophe, the public that lived through it, and I think particularly parents, remain angry about what happened. And they know that Trump was president for 10 months of it, and Biden was president for 4 years later. And this lack of faith in institutions, this lack of trust in political parties, they're responding to Republicans and Trump and all that based on what's going on in America right now. I believe that data like that suggests that they are responding to the condition of the United States as a result of what happened in the 2020s, and COVID remains the most important thing that happened in this country in the 2020s, possibly in this century, given what we seem to know about how damaging this was to people, Americans between the age of 7 and 15 who were alive, and what it means in terms of their learning loss, their emotional fragility, the mental health crisis that was epidemic in the United States among teens because of the social isolation and the acceleration of the use of social media as a substitute for personal interaction that turned out to be not only unsatisfying, but also maybe character destroying. And so I do think that reckoning you're talking about hasn't happened, but it happens anyway, without us seeing it or without it being organized, and I thought what was striking about Paul in the first 15 minutes of the hearing was how sober, judicious, and disciplined he was in his question, in his approach to Fauci, who began by insulting him and made a statement before he said, I'm taking the fifth. So he actually got a lick in before he said, I'm not going to speak anymore. And Paul just asked him the questions that he was going to ask him in his time as, chairman of the committee. And they were all perfectly reasonable questions that any sober person could have answered. And that is why he deserves surprising respect from us. I think he's a reckless and irresponsible person on foreign affairs and other questions. But this was something else. And if you watched it, which most people, I'm sure, how many of us actually watched the opening statement of the chairman of the committee? They saw clips of Fauci taking the fifth. But if you watched it, he was getting the better of the exchange, only in the sense that he was asking a perfectly reasonable question. Then Fauci said, I take my, on the advice of my attorneys, I am, Fifth Amendment. On the advice of my attorneys, Fifth Amendment. And then it looks bad, and that will have lingering consequences. It's also worth noting that Jay Bhattacharya is now head of the National Institute of Health, the person that I was too chicken to book on the commentary podcast back in 2020. So that's also a way in which there's some kind of self-correcting memechanism, even if it is trolling, even if it's sort of Trump trolling by picking.
I mean,
him.
but also it's like, we were having this discussion the other night with friends about somehow the Chernobyl miniseries came up, the HBO's miniseries, which is fantastic, really, really great. And I haven't been able to stop thinking of COVID and that, because the lying for some kind of, first of all, the noble lie. Second of all, the belief that you couldn't trust the people. Third of all, the belief that if you angered the wrong person in the government, who knows what would happen? This guy wanted to hear good news. This guy wanted to hear this kind of news. Blah blah blah. And what I saw, what was just how Soviet the COVID response looked. Now, I don't want to oversell that, because unlike China, we did not literally seal people inside of apartment buildings, which China did. I mean, China did actual totalitarian stuff that would haunt your dreams. We didn't do that. But, the attempts to dispose of the bodies of seniors, outside of hospitals in New York and things like that. I mean, there were these moments where it was like we kind of tiptoed up to a line where I think people who live under other types of government might recognize it, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think that lingers with this idea that, I don't like how Soviet this looked. Not that they took it to all the way to 10, but, a 6 on the Soviet scale is pretty horrific for a free country to go, or something like that. And the worry that, some people have said their worry about Trump is less Trump and more that he has paved the way for somebody who would be better at doing the things that Trump wants to do, to take it, dismantling the government, being corrupt, whatever. Yeah. And I think you have to have the same worries about what happened with Fauci and the movement that he was at the top of, which is, there were not that it was a practice run for a planned, again, to be clear, this is not a plandemic conspiracy theory, nor, but that you have to worry that people will get better at managing the public in this way. And that's one of the reasons we have to have this reckoning, just to say, like, it's not that we necessarily want people thrown in jail. We need to all be on the same page with, don't do the noble lie again. Trust the public. Be honest with these are things that in the future have to be done. I don't need you rotting in a cell. I just need to know that we all recognize that it shouldn't have looked like Chernobyl at any point in the process.
I want to bring, an interesting point here is that this happened naturally without us knowing it also. So let's talk about the vaccine. So we had this heroic development of the mRNA vaccine, coming basically into use 10 months after the outbreak of the pandemic, Operation Warp Speed, right? We all remember desperately trying to find a site to get our vaccinations. I had to go to Aqueduct Racetrack to get mine, 2 months after I could get the appointment, all of that. So if you were doing the Moderna vaccine, you had one, and then you had the second, and you had to have both, and you had a card that you put in your wallet that showed that you had had both vaccinations and all of that. And then, a year, however long passes, and people are noticing that people are still getting COVID, even though they've been vaccinated. And so the response was, get another vaccination. You need a third vaccination. And at this point, people went, all right, beat it. If you were over 70 or over 75, you got the third vaccination. But people were like, you know what? I know what vaccination is supposed to prevent disease. I understand your argument that this mitigates the effect of the disease. It lessens the effect of the disease if you get it, and it did have an effect in weakening the virus and all of that. But you overpromised here, and your response is that I'm supposed to just keep going to the doctor and getting a needle in my arm, or having my kids go get a needle in their arm, and I'm done with you. And that happened without the reckoning. That happened without the trust the people. The people were incredibly obedient, were incredibly responsible,
compliant,
based on the information they had. Yeah. Incredibly responsible. And then 2 years passed, and they were like, enough. And mysteriously, it was enough. The Biden people backed off. Fauci backed off. They felt the change in the atmosphere. The New York Times stopped publishing the death toll on the front pages every day. All of that because they had gone too far, and their answers had stopped being relevant, and their insistence that people do things that they did not understand why they had to do was no longer enough to direct the population to behave in ways that the elites wanted them to behave.
And also there's a responsibility along those lines, right? There were other instances where people in the moment reacted responsibly and should have told us that we were, better prepared and maybe more trustworthy as a people. One of the most incredible things about COVID, and it really is incredible, I would come home from work and throw on whatever sports was on right on the TV in the background. And so I happened to be watching the ESPN doubleheader in NBA doubleheader on March 11th, I think it was, right? And that was the day that COVID arrived, essentially. Not a government official, but Rudy Gobert, a player for one of the teams, tested positive at courtside for COVID. The teams got together at tip-off and said, I think we have to cancel the game. There was a second game of the doubleheader that was supposed to go on afterwards. The crew was all there, and the stadium was full. And they didn't know what to do. And they talked with the refs, they talked with the coaches. They had the halftime performer perform his halftime performance now, before tip-off, to buy time to figure out what was going on. And the whole time, and this was really something almost like only in America in a way, Scott Van Pelt was the anchor for the NBA season on ESPN at the time. His broadcast is a like Walter Cronkite belongs in a museum of American history sort of thing, because he's not a news guy and he's not a science guy. He's a sports guy, and he is introducing the pandemic and its consequences to the country, because that's what they were watching at that moment.
Well, Jim,
and he
can I
had
move this? I want Jim to
Yeah.
conclude this, because this takes us back to Jim's origins, the Jim Leak origins of Jim Meigs and commentary. Now that Jim Meigs is no longer, sadly, a monthly columnist for commentary, but this was the subject of your early work for the magazine.
Yeah,
which is
I thought about that when you mentioned the overreaction of the authorities. I did a piece in China 2020 about the response to the big earthquake in Alaska in the early '60s, and how the public all came together and helped each other and saved people and searched buildings. But the police department was more worried that they were all going to go rampaging through downtown, and they sent their people out to protect, the downtown shops and stuff from the wave of misbehavior they expected. And people who study disasters call this elite panic. It's a slightly melodramatic term, but it's very common for people in positions of authority when there's a disaster to, instead of focusing on the disaster, focus on the out of control, panicked, law-breaking behavior that they expect from the public. They have a low opinion of the public. You saw this after Katrina, when there were stories of gangs of youth, going around with guns and shooting at helicopters. Not true. But it affected the response. It slowed down the rescue response when people were worried about, having their helicopters be shot at. And we certainly saw it in COVID. The idea that the public couldn't handle the truth. And you mentioned, when we started in the fall of 2021, realizing there were these breakthrough infections with people who were vaccinated. A big episode happened up in Provincetown, Cape Cod, when there was some kind of big gay festival.
Rave. There was a rave, I think.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, the Bears. Andrew, you can go back and look at Andrew Sullivan's coverage of this. And a lot of these guys were vaccinated and they got COVID. And that was it was a warning sign that the vaccine didn't really prevent these breakthrough infections, although it did reduce the intensity of the symptoms. The officials didn't want to talk about it. They pretended it wasn't happening for a long time. And again, you saw these situations where new information came in, but they didn't trust the public to understand levels of nuance, the trade-offs that have to be made, or to make their own decisions. They preferred to keep kind of a lockstep. There's a great book on this from my friend David Zweig called An Abundance of Caution. And he just saw his own kids out of school in a little town near where I live in Westchester. His own kids were out of school, and he started asking questions about what the hell was going on. Why were they out of school so long? And the more he looked into it, the more outraged he became that there was no science. There was no scientific justification for these extended school shutdowns. Almost immediately, as you talked about at the time a lot, John, was almost immediately the evidence was coming in that children were almost uniquely safe from COVID. There was also evidence that teachers weren't at particular risk from being in that environment. And you can understand the initial school closures, but when they lingered on, Europe had gone back to school, Japan had gone back to school, but our American kids, and many, especially in blue states, were really kept out of schools for a long time, the masking for a long time with no good justification. Fauci could have ended all of that with just a few words. He'll say, well, I wasn't, in his autobiography, I wasn't responsible for this, I wasn't responsible for that, but he was the face of the government's COVID policy. He could have said a few words and change the tone so that all these states, all these other agencies would have been given permission, the permission structure, to use an old commentary podcast term, the permission structure to moderate their policies. He never did it.
Jim Meigs, I'm so glad that you could join us to illuminate this very interesting week. I don't know where we go from here with this, whether there will be more revelations to come, what will happen with this question of Fauci being held in contempt of Congress, whatever. But this is this is an ongoing American story because the consequences of what happened here are generational, and we have not, we've only scratched the surface sociologically of understanding the effects of the pandemic and the American response to the pandemic, and we'll be living with those analyses, I think, probably for the rest of my life. Maybe Seth, a much younger fellow than I, will be able to
John,
move on to something else.
I'm sorry to interrupt your wrap up, but I should say one of the legacies that we didn't really touch on, in addition to the lack of socialization and the isolation and the stunted development and all of that, the sort of other side of that is the backlash to everything we're talking about, and the wild, unbridled wave of distrust that it unleashed across this country, and that's all you don't put that back in the bottle so easily either.
I mean, a very important point here, because of course, like, we know that it is very dangerous to our polity that people have lost faith in the institutions that are meant to be part of the self-governing structure of the United States, and therefore should be their power should be mitigated, and their ability to misbehave should be mitigated by our system of checks and balances, and by the fact that this is a country in which the governed are only governed by consent, and something was interrupted there, and we are now living in a world in which people don't trust the Republicans, they don't trust the Democrats, they don't trust the health system, they don't trust the banks, they don't trust the tech companies. Nobody trusts anybody, except I think people trust the military. They trust the military, and that's really about it. And I think there was a time 20 years ago when if you'd asked, do you trust your doctor, or do you trust like the healthcare's, not the healthcare system because they don't like the insurance companies, but do you like the American medical, do you trust your healthcare professionals who you work with? That would have been very much like the military now. And I just don't think people feel that way even about their doctors now. And so, we don't know how we're going to survive that either. Like, that loss of faith in institutions is a loss of faith in our Republican structure, really. And so, again, something we're going to be living with forever. So again, Jim Meigs, to be read weekly in the on the Free Expression vertical at the Wall Street Journal and in City Journal. And always a pleasure. And so for Abe and Seth, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.